Welcome to Chapter 9, Participation, Campaigns, and Elections. In this chapter, we will talk about campaigns and elections and how voters participate, which is about who gets involved and why. There are many more opportunities to engage in non-voting political participation, even though voting is central to democracy. Elections are rare events with national contests only held every other year. Political participation refers to a wide range of activities designed to influence government, politics, and policy. It includes traditional forms of participation, such as voting and volunteering, as well as new online forms of participation. Democracy cannot function if citizens do not participate in the political process. They are the ones who actually choose our elected officials. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances, the right of free speech, and the right of free association, all of which are key forms of political participation. Theorists such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Stuart Mill thought that people accepted adverse decisions more if they participated in the process. People can and do participate in other political activities year-round, both on and offline. The internet and social media are allowing digital political participation. This includes mobilizing supporters through social media, posting on blogs, and viewing online campaign ads. Social media and the internet give citizens a greater access to political information than ever before. Social connections are also important to political participation. Digital participation in politics is rapidly changing the way Americans experience the political process. The internet and social media give citizens greater access to political information about candidate and campaigns and a greater role in politics than ever before. This includes mobilizing supporters through social media, posting on blogs, and viewing online campaign ads. Social media platforms are a key networking tool for politics. They help to disseminate information quickly and give candidates the opportunity to share their own message if the media are not covering it how the candidate would like it to be covered. Online mobilization works effectively through emotional appeals, immediacy, personal networks, and social pressure. One social network plays a much stronger role in political participation than do individual factors such as income and education. Americans believe that change is best accomplished through the ballot box. Elections connect citizens with their government, by which they signify consent and through which they accomplish peaceful change. The costs of voting always outweigh the probability that one vote will be pivotal. In a presidential election, for one vote to matter, a state that is pivotal in the Electoral College must be decided by one vote. So why do so many people vote? Some view it as their civic duty. Others overestimate the probability that their vote will matter, while many simply enjoy the act of voting despite the costs of voting. Scholars examine the benefits that some people receive from voting, such as feeling good about the act or wearing the I voted sticker on Election Day. As with most activities surrounding the political process, a person's social background and socioeconomic status affects their likelihood of voting. Americans with higher levels of education, more income, and higher level occupations participate much more. Education is the most important factor in predicting whether a person will vote or engage in other kinds of political activities. Socioeconomic status is correlated with higher political participation also. Individuals are more likely to vote if they have higher levels of education, which is, like I said, the most important factor in predicting voter turnout. If they have higher levels of income, and just so you know that minorities and young people are less likely to participate. Older people have much higher rates of participation in part because they are more likely to own homes and pay property taxes, which make them more aware of the importance of government. Do you think this is something that we should be concerned about? Are the priorities of citizens with lower levels of education potentially being overlooked because they are not voting for candidates who may share their values and attitudes? Mobilization efforts and the political environment are also important, such as, has the person been asked to vote for a particular candidate? Is it a competitive election? And do they think that their vote will actually make a difference? The political environment helps to understand individual political behavior. Mobilization efforts attract voters to the polls. which is the process by which large numbers of people are organized for a political activity. Electoral competition, or a lack thereof. There is a higher turnout in more competitive elections than you will find in elections where there's no one on the ballot except one candidate. State electoral laws are very different, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the next slide. State electoral laws vary from state to state. Registration requirements are different. Some are the same day registration, some are 30 days prior, some are 15 days prior, some require identification to register, and some don't. In some states, even automatically register you to vote. In the American federal system, the responsibilities for running elections is decentralized, resting largely with the state and local government. Elections are administered by the state, county, and city election boards, which are responsible for establishing and staffing polling places, processing mail-in ballots, and verifying the eligibility of voters. State electoral laws can also create formal barriers to voting, such as requiring an ID, which some states require and other states do not. If you don't have an ID, then you're unable to register to vote. All states implement voting and election laws differently, and there are very different voter turnout rates by state. Because registration requirements vary by state and can reduce turnout, impact is often the greatest on people who are young, less educated, and less affluent. State laws influence who may vote, how they vote, and where they vote. America has more elections than other countries, even though it seems like 2 a year is not that many. So some political scientists blame voter fatigue for low voter turnout. It's also important to consider why people don't vote. Critics argue that election rules in the U.S. make it difficult for voters to exercise their right to vote. Low turnout could be an accidental consequence of laws intended for other purposes. Registration laws that require a person be registered before they can vote can limit voter turnout. About 1/3 of the electorate never registers and is therefore ineligible to vote. And voting on Tuesday limits people who work. Personally, I find this to be a lame excuse because the polls are typically open 12 or 13 days on election day. And our frequency of elections also can cause people to not participate because we are considered to vote a lot, like I said, because we have 2 elections per year. And attitude is also important. If people think that their participation doesn't matter, they are less likely to take the time to vote. People who identify less with a party are less likely to identify with a candidate and therefore less likely to pay attention and to vote. Voter turnout is very important. Elections can be won or lost based upon voter turnout, particularly at the lower level, the local level. The change in efforts of politicians and political parties to contact likely voters has changed this, and personal contact increases voter turnout as those efforts decrease, so did turnout. The electoral process in the United States has many rules, from who can vote to how you can even get on the ballot, rules which are set by each individual state. The U.S. is one of the few countries in the world to use the primary election. In most countries, nominations are controlled by party officials, but our process is more democratic because the people actually get to choose the candidates. The primary election is the election held within a political party to select each party's candidates for the general election. In local, state, and congressional elections, the winners of the primary face one another in the general election, and the dates of the primary are set by each individual state. In most states, only the members of that particular political party may vote in a primary election. This is called a closed primary. States like South Dakota and Pennsylvania have a closed primary. Other states allow all registered voters to choose either ballot on the day of the primary. This is called an open primary. States like Minnesota and Ohio have an open primary. A caucus is used by some states like Iowa to nominate presidential candidates. It's essentially a business meeting to select candidates. The general election is the same for the entire country. It's held on the first Tuesday following the first Monday in November. There is much more national mobilization and awareness about the general election, especially about the presidential election, their candidates and their issues, and hence a higher turnout. Since the 1890s, participation in elections has declined substantially. One pattern that is consistent across time is that more Americans tend to vote in presidential election years than in years when only congressional and local elections are held. Before the presidential election every 4 years, the major parties start the process of selecting their presidential candidates by holding primary elections and caucuses. The primaries and caucuses traditionally begin in January or February of a presidential election year and end in June, with state elections roughly every 2 weeks. The result of each state's primary election or caucus determines how its delegates will vote at their party's national convention. As part of the party convention, the delegates also decide on the party's platform, which is a statement of principles and pledges around which the delegates can unite. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the Electoral College, which is a group of electors who formally select the president and vice president. Voters in the United States do not directly elect the president. We are the only country to use this method. When Americans vote for president, they are technically not voting directly for the candidates, even though that is what it looks like on their ballot. They are instead choosing among slates of electors selected by each party in the state and pledge to support their party's candidates. A candidate needs 270 of the Electoral College's 538 votes. Only 2 states do not award all of their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote in their state. Since electoral votes are won on a state-by-state basis, it is mathematically possible for a candidate who receives the most popular votes nationwide to fail to carry enough states for their elected votes to add up to a majority. This has happened 4 times, most recently in 2016 when Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College. And in our country, voting rights are granted to almost all citizens aged 18 and older. But still, U.S. voter turnout is nationally relatively very low. Voter turnout is the percentage of eligible individuals who actually vote. And since the 1960s, turnout has been about 60% in presidential elections. In non-presidential election years, it is much lower. This is a map of the 2020 election distribution of Electoral College votes, where you can see the blue represents the states that President Biden won, and the red represents the states that President Trump won. Maine and Nebraska are the only 2 states who split their Electoral College votes. Because of the complexity of the election process and the amount of money that candidates must raise, presidential campaigns often begin almost 2 years before the general election. Congressional campaigns begin a year before. The campaign is an effort by political candidates and their constituents, consultants, supporters, and volunteers to win the backing of donors, political activists, and voters in their quest for political office. Incumbents have an advantage over challengers because they already have the infrastructure ready to go for the campaign cycle and access to volunteers and money, and are more well known. Campaigns at the federal and state level typically hire consultants to help with crafting a campaign message, organizing volunteers, raising money, doing polls, speaking to the press, and organizing direct mail and social media. Candidates generally start raising money before they face an election. They raise money from individual donors, political action committees, and all of this money must be reported to the Federal Election Commission because there are campaign contribution limits. Stock money is allowed under federal rules. It permits the national political parties to make unlimited independent expenditures, advocating support for its own presidential candidate or the defeat of the opposition, as long as those expenditures are not coordinated with the candidate's own campaign. Campaigns are also affected by the use of outside spending and independent expenditures, such as super PACs and dark money, whose campaign coffers are not covered by spending restrictions, and may now raise much of the money used for political campaigns. They can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money for campaigns. The right of an individual to spend their own money to campaign for office is a constitutionally protected matter of free speech and not subject to limitation. There are essentially 2 types of campaigns in the United States: grassroots and mass media. Grassroots are campaigns that operate at the local level. They often use face-to-face communication to generate interest and momentum by citizens. Contemporary political campaigns rely on a number of communication tools to reach the voters they want to target for support, including TV, radio, social media, and micro-targeting. Digital media can be especially important in mobilizing people to vote. Today, every campaign for presidential, congressional, and major state offices develops a social media campaign for fundraising, mobilizing supporters, and getting out the vote. It's very popular because it's cheap. All of these are pieces to a successful political campaign, but they are meaningless unless you turn out the vote. Mobilization includes all efforts to get out the vote, whether that's text messages, social media posts, phone calls, face-to-face campaigning. Mobilization is very, very important. It is very expensive to run for office, particularly for Congress, the U.S. Senate or President, or statewide governor. It also costs money to run for school board, city council, county commissioner, and state representative. There are costs associated with getting on the ballot, printing campaign literature, mailing campaign information, making phone calls, attending events, buying gas for your car, having a campaign office, buying pizza for volunteers, etc. Some scholars suggest that perhaps only rich people donate to political campaigns, but this is simply not true. There are people who send checks for $10 or $25 to their member of Congress. I know this because I have been raising money for candidates for many years. So if you only learn one thing about political contributions from this entire chapter, learn this. It is not only rich people who donate to political candidates. So where else do candidates get their money besides from small donors? They get it from themselves because candidates can use their own money to run for office. Federal candidates can be reimbursed up to a certain amount once they start raising money. Some states set limits on how much state and local candidates can raise from individuals, but some do not. But there are limits on how much an individual can give to candidates for federal office. This number is reevaluated for inflation and is often increased. A political action committee, also known as a PAC, is an organization established by a corporation. The PAC is funded by donations from the employees, and then a group of employees decides which candidates get the money. No corporate money is used here. The limit here is $5,000 per PAC per election cycle. 527s, 501c4s, and super PACs are independent groups that are not organized under the campaign restrictions that govern individuals and PACs. They can raise and spend unlimited amounts on political advocacy as long as their efforts are not coordinated with the candidate's campaign. A 501c4 is not required to disclose where it gets its money, and this has raised concerns about the lack of transparency in campaign funding and how it threatens free elections, in contrast to all the money from the candidate, individuals, and PACs, which must be disclosed on quarterly reports to the Federal Election Commission. So the purpose of a political action committee is to channel contributions from their members to political campaigns. Remember, they're not using any corporate money here. Nearly 2/3 of all PACs represent corporations, trade associations, and other businesses and professional groups. 527s and 501c4s basically engage in issue advocacy. A 501c4 may not spend more than half of their revenue for political purposes. As far as public funding goes, the Federal Election Campaign Act provides for public funding of presidential campaigns. In the nomination phase, candidates must raise at least $5,000 in individual contributions of $250 or less in each of 20 states. If that threshold is met, candidates may apply for matching funds on dollar-for-dollar basis. In the general election phase, major party nominees receive a lump sum, about $96 million in 2016. Under current campaign law, no candidate is required to accept public funding. If you do not accept public funding, you are not bound by expenditure limits. The 2008 race was the last time any candidate accepted public funding, and that candidate was John McCain. Barack Obama did not accept the funding and far outspent John McCain. Personal funds. Like I said before, candidates are free to spend their own money in unlimited sums. This was established with the court case Buckley v. Vallejo, which introduced the concept that money is speech and allows unlimited spending by candidates on their own campaigns. Transitions between party systems in American history are sometimes called electoral realignments, the point in history when a new party replaces the party in power. During these periods, the coalitions that support the parties and the balance of power between the parties are redefined. In historical terms, realignment occurs when new issues, combined with economic or political crises, mobilize new voters and persuade large numbers of voters to permanently shift their support from one party to the other. Major partisan realignments are rare in the United States, occurring on average about once every 50 years. When they do occur, it is often the result of new issues or societal problems, coupled with crises that weaken the established political elite and allow new groups of politicians to create coalitions capable of capturing the reins of governmental power. Currently, party politics are characterized by polarization and divided government. Though we do not elect the president directly, members of Congress, governors, and state legislators are directly elected. Some states have other forms of direct democracy, such as the initiative, the referendum, and recall. Ballot initiatives allow citizens to circulate petitions to place policy change or propose laws directly on the ballot for a popular vote. If the initiative receives the majority support, then it becomes law. Voters will sometimes choose this option when their legislature refuses to consider issues the public deems important. A referendum is when the legislature refers certain laws to the voters for a popular vote. The general referendum and initiative are called direct democracy because they allow voters to govern directly without intervention from government officials or political parties. These can be overruled by the court if it is found that the initiative violates the state's constitution. 18 states also allow for recall elections, which permit voters to remove state officials from their position before their term expires. Federal officials are not subject to recall. Typically, you will see governors as the subject of a recall election campaign. Political parties are always working hard to stay relevant, especially as the world of politics has been turned upside down through social media and the 24-hour news cycle. There are 4 resources that political parties and candidates use to contest and win elections: time, money, expertise, and organization, and they have all been altered by social media and the internet. You should give some thought to the following. As it becomes increasingly expensive to run for office, are we limiting our pool of candidates to wealthy individuals or to people who have access to wealth to fund their campaigns? It's also important to think about the elaborate and intense efforts that have been made by both parties since 2000 to get more voters from diverse backgrounds involved in the political process. Even with all of these efforts by the parties and interest groups, many Americans still do not participate in the political process. These are just some of the questions that political scientists, elected officials, and the regular American voter need to consider as we work together to guarantee that our election process is safe, fair, and accessible to all eligible voters.